Okay, so 9.4, choosing a method for solving quadratic equations. Like I talked about, now we're going to combine all our solving techniques into problems where you're not going to be told how to solve. You're going to have to look at the problem and then kind of determine how to solve that. So our essential question is, how can you choose a method for solving a given quadratic equation? So as we work through this, I'm going to work through several problems, and we'll start to see some patterns of when you should use what techniques. So first one here is 7x squared minus 3x minus 5. Now, in general, factoring is going to be your easiest one, so we're going to X box here. So 7 times negative 5 is negative 35, and then we get negative 3. So what multiplies negative 35 and adds to negative 3? So 1 and 35 doesn't work. 2, 3 doesn't work. 4, 5 doesn't work. Or 5 works. And 5 and 7 does multiply to 35, but does not have a difference of negative 3. And so we're stuck. So in this case, factoring does not work. So factoring's out. Then the other method we had was solve by square rooting. Well, what we did is we moved our non-x term over, and we got 7x squared minus 3x equals 5. So then we take the square root, and then our issue there is we still have a 7 here, and then how do we square root the negative 3x? So we have that issue. One of them we can fix, which is dividing by the 7. But if we divide by the 7, we then get x squared minus 3 over 7x equals 5 over 7. So then now we have this fractions. We try to take the square root. We still have this term here, which doesn't really help us at all. So from here, we are then going to have to do our method that we learned from 9.3, which is quadratic formula. So we get x equals negative b, which is negative 3 in this case. Again, just because there's a negative there, don't forget to write the negative that comes with the formula. Plus or minus the square root of b squared. Don't forget parentheses around your negative so that you square that as well. Minus 4ac. A is 7 and c is negative 5, and that is all over to a. Two negatives here make a positive 3. Plus or minus 3 squared is 9. 4 times 7 is 28, and then 28 times 5 is 140. And then we have two negatives, which makes it positive, and then 2 times 7 is 14. And then combining inside the radical, you get 3 plus or minus the square root of 149 all over 14. We check and see if 149 can break down. Which it can't. All we have is 1 and 149, so we have a prime number. So then this becomes our answer. If we needed a specific decimal answer, we could plug that into a calculator and get a decimal answer out, but that is totally okay as an answer there. Problem that we did, we did quadratic formula on this one, and it was the only method that worked for us. And so as we already talked about this one a little bit. So a question I want you to answer and we'll discuss in class is, another method you learn for solving quadratics is taking square roots. Why would that not work in this case? So another one, let's go ahead and try to factor. So in this case our A is 1. So 1 times 6 is 6. Our B is 7. And what multiplies to 6 and adds to 7? Well, that's 6 and 1. Go ahead and do our box. We get x squared and 6. 6x and x. GCF, this becomes 6. That becomes x. That becomes x. And that becomes 1. And we get x plus 6 and x plus 1 equals 0. When we solve, you get x equals negative 6 and negative 1. Now, this one here, when we try to solve by taking the square root, we can't. A similar deal is, how do we deal with that 7x? Now, quadratic formula, we get x equals negative b plus or minus radical b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So we get negative 7 plus or minus radical 49. 4 times 1 is 4, times 6 is 24. And that's all over 2. And then negative 7 plus or minus 49 minus 24 is 25. All over 2. And then the square root of 25 is 5, so we get plus or minus 5 all over 2. As we continue to work here, we get negative 7 plus 5 is a negative 2 over 2. And then negative 7 minus 5 is a negative 12 over 2. Simplify that, negative 2 over 2 is negative 1. Negative 12 over 2 is negative 6. Which, if we look, comparing it to our previous, negative 1 and 6, negative 1 and 6, those are the same. So as we look at this as a whole, we can see factoring was definitely shorter and easier, but quadratic formula did work. Like if we go back and look at, go forward, we then see that quadratic formula is nice because it does work every time. So let's try another one here. So can we factor? So 2 times 3 is 6, and then 8. And so what multiplies to 6 and adds to 8? So again, on this one, we get nothing, so factoring doesn't work. Again, we have that middle term and the leading coefficient that can create us some problems with solving by square roots. So if we did subtract a 3x over, we get negative 3. We can divide by 2, which isn't so bad this time because it simplifies with that 8, and you get 4x equals negative 3/2. But now how do we deal with that 4x? If I move it over, I have x's on both sides. If I take square root, that does cancel that potentially, except we are adding to that a plus 4x, so we can't cancel it. So how do we deal with that? So again, solving by the square root doesn't work so well for us. So then we go to our trusty quadratic formula. So we get x equals negative b, which is 8 this time, plus or minus the radical 8 squared minus 4a, which is 2, and c, which is 3, all over 2a. Do a little simplification, and we get negative 8 plus or minus 64. 4 times 2 is 8, times 3 is 24. So we'll subtract 24 since there's only one negative, all over 4. And then we get negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 40, all over 4. And then we're going to take 40 and break that down. We get 4 and 10. That becomes 2 and 2, and that becomes 2 and 5. So there's our pair. 2 and 5 are left on the inside. So this becomes negative 8 plus or minus 2 root 10 all over 4. And we can see that a 2 goes in all of these, so 2 goes into 8 4 times, 2 goes into 2 once, and 2 goes into 4 twice. And so we get negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 10 all over 2. And then that becomes our final answer there. Okay, so this one here, if we try to factor, we get GCF, which is 3, and we get x squared minus 12 equals 0. We have no middle term, so then we would try difference of squares, and so I get x and x, but nothing squares to give us 12, so we can't really factor it that way. So then let's try our by square roots. So in square roots we would add 36 over. Then I could divide by 3. And we get x squared equals 12. Now I can take the square root, and x equals plus or minus the square root of 12, which we can simplify. 12 breaks down to 4 and 3, and that becomes 2 and 2. There's my pair. So then x equals plus or minus 2 root 3. Now let's see with quadratic formula. We'd get x equals negative b, which in this case is 0, plus or minus radical 0 squared minus 4 times a, which is 3, times c, which is a negative 36, and then all over 2a. Well, simplifying, that 0 drops out, so then we get plus or minus the radical. Well, and 0 squared is just 0, so we get the square root of 4 times 3, which is 12, and then 12 times 36 is 432, and 2 negatives make it positive, and then 2 times 3 is 6. Then looking at 432, we can divide by 4, and we get 4 and 108. And then 4 and 27. 27 becomes 9 and 3. 9 becomes 3 and 3. And I forgot about these 4s. Those become 2 and 2. And 2 and 2. There's a pair. There's a pair. And there's a pair. So we get 2 times 2, which is 4, times 3 is 12. So this becomes plus or minus 12 square root of 3, all divided by 6. 12 divided by 6 is 2, and then we're left with root 3. So as you can see, once again, 2 different ways to solve, but exact same result. In this case, square rooting is a lot shorter and simpler than quadratic formula, but once again, our trusty old quadratic formula works. Alright, so reflect. I want you to go ahead and answer these questions, and we'll discuss them in class. So first one, what are the advantages and disadvantages of solving a quadratic equation by taking square roots? So think about the problems we've done. Go back in the video and look at some of those. I gave specific reasons or issues that you could have. And then go on to what are the advantages and disadvantages of solving a quadratic equation by factoring. And what are the advantages and disadvantages of solving a quadratic equation by using quadratic formula. Again, for all of these, go back and rewatch, look at the examples I did, and see where there's some issues and where there's some advantages to all of those. Alright, so this is your practice here. So go ahead and pause the video and work through these problems. Okay, so looking at this first one here, number 6, I would try to solve by taking the square root because there is no b term. So when we have ax squared plus bx plus c, when I see no b term, I'm going to try to solve by square root. So I'm going to add 100. You get 9x squared equals 100. Divide by 9. We get x squared equals 100 over 9, which we can take the square root of. And then x equals plus or minus square root of 100 is 10. Square root of 9 is 3. And it works, and we're done. Alright, number 7. We have a b term. And so with that, I'm going to then try to factor. I think we can always do a quick check there. So 1 times negative 7 is negative 7. And then we get 4. 1 multiplies negative 7 adds to 4. Nothing, because the only things multiplied to 7 are 1 and 7. That never will get you to 4. So factoring is not the method we're going to use here. We're not going to use square roots, so that means quadratic formula. So x equals negative b plus or minus radical b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, and then simplifying we get negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 16. 4 times 1 is 4 times 7 is 28. 2 negatives make a positive, and that is all over 2. And then we get negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 44 all over 2. And then simplifying here, so first 44 breaks down to 4 and 11. 4 is 2 and 2, there's my pair. So this becomes negative 4 plus or minus 2 root 11 all over 2. 2 goes in all of these, so 2 goes into 4 twice, 2 once, and 2 once. And so our final answer is negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 11, which is why we could not factor it. Alright, so applying this now to a model. So we have Marcos throwing a tennis ball at a kite that is stuck 42 feet up in a tree, trying to knock it loose. He can throw the ball at a velocity of 45 feet per second upward at a height of 4 feet. Will his throw reach the kite, and how hard does Marco need to throw the ball to reach the kite? So we're going to use our equation h equals negative 16t squared plus v of t plus s. Negative 16 comes from the gravitational equivalent of feet per second. Our v is our velocity, and s is our starting position, and h is our final height. So as we look at this, we get negative 16t squared plus our initial velocity of 45 feet per second, and then our starting height is 4, because it's the starting height of the tennis ball being thrown. And then our final height is what we're hoping to get to is 42. And then from there, we're going to check and get this set equal to 0 and see if we can't solve it from there. Does Marco have enough to reach the kite? Alright, so go ahead and subtract the 42. And we get 0 equals negative 16t squared plus 45t minus 38. Now, initially we can't factor. There is no GCF, so factoring is not going to be easy. And a good thing is we talked about discriminant in the previous lesson. It's a good way to check to see if something actually works, if we'll have some real solutions. So remember, the discriminant is just whatever is under the radical, so it's the b squared minus 4ac. So in this case we get 45 squared minus 4 times a, which is a negative 16, times c, which is negative 38. Plug that into a calculator and work that out, and you get negative 407, which, since that's negative, we know that we have no real solutions, which answers that first question, does he have? And so the answer to that question is no. So then we need to figure out what the velocity that is needed. So as we go back, and we can get rid of part of this here, but let's take a look back at our equation first. We have this here. We know our velocity is not going to get it there, so what we're going to do is we're going to replace our velocity here, which was 45t. We're going to replace it with v because it's an unknown now. So then we get 0 equals negative 16t squared plus v of t minus 38. We want to solve for that velocity. Well, we already used the discriminant, and the nice thing is now our b, instead of being 45, is now just v. So we can substitute that in right there. And by doing so, that's going to change this answer down here, and we want it to get to real solutions. And really we just need one real solution. We don't need it twice. So as we talked about before in 9.3, that for one real solution it just needs to be set equal to 0. So then we get v squared, and then multiplying 4 times 16 times 38 is 2,432. We have 3 negatives, so that becomes negative, and that is equal to 0. Add 2,432 to both sides, and you get v squared equals 2,432. Takes the square root, and v equals plus or minus 49.3. And then a little physics lesson here. So velocity is a speed with a direction. So the negative 49.3 means downward direction, and the positive 49.3 means an upward direction. Well, since the kite is stuck in a tree, that is upward, which means that negative velocity being thrown down does not help us. So then the velocity Marco would need is 49.3 feet per second. Alright, your turn to practice through one. Go ahead and pause so you can read through this and see what the questions are. You can see we get our 40 feet, our 24 feet per second, and the questions we're trying to answer is how long does it take to fall to the ground. So remember, the height at ground level is 0. So we want to set up the equation, determine the time, and pick one method to solve it. Explain why you chose that method. So setting up that equation for you is going to be 0 equals negative 16t squared plus our initial velocity of 24t plus the starting height of 40. So I want you to go ahead and work through this, determine what method you want to use. At the end, as long as you can get to an answer that is correct, of the 3 possible methods, it doesn't matter which one you pick. Some just are easier and some almost are impossible to do. So work through this, make sure you have your reasoning why you chose the one you chose, because we will discuss this in class. And your essential question is, how should you determine a method for solving a quadratic equation? Again, think back through all the problems we did and kind of create a list of what you would run through to check for what methods you would use. And then go ahead and jump over to Classroom and click on the link for the quizzes, so that way you can work through that as well. And then last, your assignment is 9.4 on page 404, number 1 through 21 odd and 20